Welcome to London Lights. In this episode, we're going to be talking about the one and only Walt Disney and his family's connection to the London and Huron County area. My guest today is Bob Degraw. Now, Bob was a former manager at Northern Telecom in London for many years and also a church minister in Huron County. And he has a special interest in the Disney family and their roots in Huron County and locally in London. So Bob, we're happy to have you here today with us.
Nice to be here, Dan.
Thanks for joining us. Now, of course, that was your introduction. Walt Disney probably doesn't need any introduction, but I will mention this. He was a 20th century icon. He was an entertainment legend. There's no question about it. He was born in Chicago in 1901, and he died in 1966 at the age of 65. What people don't know is that his father was born right here in Ontario. He was a Canadian and not too far from London. Disney holds the record for the most Academy Awards earned by an individual, having won 22 Oscars, and he was nominated 59 times. He was a cartoonist, and he introduced synchronized sound to his movies. He did movies in Technicolor. He created and founded Disneyland in California and Disney World in Florida, which are the premier amusement parks in the world, without question. So Disney is well known. Bob, let's start by finding out about your interest in Walt Disney and the family. How did this get started for you?
Actually, three major things happened. My father, who was in the Second World War, returned from the war in 1945, Second World War. And sometime after that, when he was in London, he had need of a rooming place, hotel room, or a rooming place. And there was a rooming place on the corner of Queens and Clarence Street. And my dad stayed at that rooming house. There was a lady that ran it, and she was very proud of the fact that one day, several years before that, there was a man there that had stayed by the name of Walt Disney. And she told my dad the story. He came down from his room one morning with his case packed and said, "I'm going to California, and I'm either going to be broke, completely broke, or I'm going to make $1 million." My dad told me that story, and I thought it very interesting. And the second thing that happened, besides my dad telling me that story, my mother-in-law one day called me and told me that she had her roof leaking in her house and wanted to know if I could come over and check it. So I came over, went up in the attic, checked the roof leak, but the main thing is that I found a cardboard box in that attic with old newspapers in it. And one of the newspapers was the centennial edition of the London Free Press, 1949. And in 1949, the London Free Press, in their centennial edition, carried every major story that had happened in their press area in the previous 100 years. And looking through that paper, I seen the picture of a house up at Bluevale. And in the picture, it said this was where Walt Disney lived. Walt Disney built this house. This is where Walt Disney's father was born.
Sorry, let me back you up there. I don't think you meant to say Walt Disney built the house.
Not Walt Disney.
His grandfather did, correct?
You're right. His grandfather built the house, and his father was born in that house.
Right.
And so that was at Bluevale, a little place just outside of
Godrich?
Godrich, not far from Godrich. And so it attracted my interest, and I wondered if that house was still there. And so one day I took a trip up to Bluevale to ask questions to see if anybody knew where that house was. And to my surprise, there was hardly a person. Well, I asked several people that never heard of Disney ever being in that area. until finally I went into the garage. The garage guy didn't know about it, but he looked on the computer and he found the address for that house, which was maybe 2, 3 miles away from where we were. So I drove to that house, and sure enough, that house was there. It had been built over top. Taking the picture from the London Free Press and comparing it to the house, all the house lines were still there. Everything was there. That was the original house that Walt Disney's grandfather had built.
And isn't it funny that this incredible 20th century icon, Walt Disney, his father is a Canadian, and he's from Bluevale.
Correct.
And he was born in that house in Bluevale that you went and looked at.
Yes.
Yet, even the residents of Bluevale that you spoke to had no knowledge about this incredible historical fact.
Amazing.
What is it about Canadians that we just don't honor our history?
It really amazes me that we don't. That house in the United States would be a museum, and people would come from the four corners of the earth to see it, where Walt Disney's father was born. And then
I don't want to interrupt your story. I know you were going to tell me about the third item, so I'll let you do that in a moment. Yes. And then we'll talk about our trip up there as well to Bluevale. Okay. But what was the third item that piqued your interest in Disney?
My first grandchild, oldest grandchild, and his brother, born a couple of years after him. My wife and I took him to Fort Wilderness in Florida, to Disney World. And he was just absolutely amazed with the Disney community there and all that was there. And he had a God-given talent of drawing cartoons, very interesting cartoons. And I think he made up his mind on that trip when he was a young boy, 8 years old or so, that someday I'm going to work for Disney. And so later on in life, when he was about 14 years old, on his own, he made up some sample drawings of cartoons, sent them away, unknown to his mother and father, to the Disney Corporation. And one day the phone rang at their house, and his father answered the phone, and they wanted to know if there was a Joshua Mills that lived there. And my son-in-law said, yes, I'm his father. Is there a reason for wanting to speak to him? And they said, well, this is the Disney Corporation. We received some samples from your son, and we would like to interview him. We'd like to bring him down to headquarters and interview him. And my father said, he isn't out of school. He's still in high school, and he is not interested, and he hung up the phone. It was several years later before my grandson learned that his father had answered the phone and refused them to talk to him.
Well, and that's the beauty of art and the imagination of someone like Walt Disney. It's inspirational. But it's interesting that you say these three items occurred in your life and created an interest in Disney. And were you able at some point to find out more about the Disney family and how they even ended up coming to Ontario?
I did. I did as much research as possible. I found more items in that paper, such as his visit from Bluevale. Walt Disney personally visited Bluevale. And the reason he did that was there was a Mrs. Atkins that knew the Disneys when they lived in that area. And she had communicated to Walt and said, you should come and see your father's birthplace, and where his grandfather had built this house. And so one day he took it up on her.
Hey, let me stop you there, Bob. I want to talk about that after the commercial break. But I'm talking about Walt's grandparent, great-grandparent. How did they end up coming to Ontario? Where did they come from?
Okay, they came from Ireland in 1801. His great-grandfather's name was Arundel Elias Disney. Had married not too long before, had one child that was 2 years old, Keppel. And things were not good in Ireland at that time. The potato crops were bad. Land was expensive. and they decided they're going to go to a new country and see if they can make a new start. So they relocated. They got on a boat, Liverpool, England. The boat's name was New Jersey. Traveled to New York, and between when they traveled to New York and ended up in Ontario, there's a little distance of time, probably about 5 years. But they ended up in Godrich and purchased 149 acres of ground just outside of Holmesville, lot 38 and 39, 149 acres, put up a log house, moved in, and in that log house, there was another 15 children born. He had 16 children
Wow.
in that little house there in the country. So that's when he came. And so that was the start. That was his great grandfather.
Yeah, and I think that was 1834 when he actually arrived in Huron County.
You're right.
His son Keppel was born, as you mentioned, and Walt's father, Elias, was born in Bluevale in 1859.
Correct.
Attended school there and moved at age 18. There's some record also from the Huron County Museum that they attended a school in Godrich for a period of time.
Yes.
And that's been explored by Huron County Museum. And I would encourage people to check in with them for more information. You might be able to find out more than what you'll hear in this program. But Bob, we're going to take a short break. We have to allow for a commercial. So hang on to those thoughts. And when we come back with Bob Degraw, we're going to talk about Walt Disney and where he was born and his return trip to Huron County and the visit to London that Bob heard about from his father, Cornelius, who stayed at Ma Barker's rooming house at the corner of Clarence Street and Queens Avenue in London, Ontario. All right, we're going to take this break. We'll be right back. Stay with us. Okay, we're back with Bob Degraw, a local amateur historian in Huron County who has looked into the story and the facts surrounding the birth of Walt Disney's father in Bluevale, Ontario, just outside of Godrich. And also, Bob has some very interesting information about a purported visit of Walt Disney to London, Ontario, which he and I believe was around 1922, 1923, just before Disney headed to California. So, Bob, we know Walt Disney was born in Chicago in 1901. So Walt's father spent 18 years here in Canada, in Huron County, and then went on to find his own fame and fortune. Is that correct?
That's correct.
What do you know about that?
Well, Walt's father, somewhat like his father, was always looking for gold at the end of the rainbow. And he did several things even before he left Canada. He went to Oil Springs where oil had been discovered and started to drill or to dig an oil well. And that did not work out. So he went back to the farm. And then he heard about salt being discovered in Godrich. And so he went to Godrich to see what was going on. He was right there at the beginning of salt being discovered. And they discovered salt by actually they discovered it when they were drilling for oil. And they found salt. And so Walt's grandfather thought, well, maybe I can get in on this. So he put down a pipe and started mining salt through a pipe, through brine. There was no big mine down there that they had opened up, but in the early days, they put down a pipe, forced water down the pipe, and the brine come up. The brine, they used to put it in our iron kettles there beside the Maitland River, build a fire under it, and evaporate the moisture off, and that was the salt.
And he didn't find his fame and fortune there, correct?
He didn't find it. But he moved his family while this was going on in Oil Springs and
Yeah.
in Goderich. He moved his family, it looks like, in with his wife's sister in Goderich, and they lived with his wife's sister while this was going on. And because of that, Walt's father and brother Robert went to school in Goderich for some time. So now, Keppel being unsettled and the salt didn't materialize to be a real gold thing for him, but he heard of gold being discovered in California, the California gold rush. And so he thought, well, I'm going to sell out, I'm going to sell the farm. I'm going to California, I'm going to find gold and become very wealthy. He sold the farm. First of all, took his two oldest sons, Elias, who was the first one that was born,
Walt's father.
Walt's father, and Robert, his brother, the next brother, and headed to California to get this gold. While on the train, going through Kansas, talking to the people on the train, he learned that the land was being sold very reasonable along that route. The railroad had bought large tracts of land.
Bob, let me stop you there. I'll tell you
Yes.
why, because I'm just very concentrated on our time here and I don't want to run out. So let me
Okay.
kind of fast forward. I'll hit the fast forward button here for a minute. So we know that Disney himself, Walt, started to do cartoons in Kansas, and basically things went sideways and it was a bust. So Walt now is in a position where he's got to find greener pastures.
Yes.
And he's basically broke. He's bankrupt in
He's broke.
Kansas, correct?
Yes.
So, as part of your story and what you learned from your father about Ma Barker, which can be confirmed in the London Public Library archives,
Yes.
there is a period of time where Walt ends up in London, Ontario. He's got how much in his pocket? How much money?
Well, when he left, he had $40 in his pocket.
And he said to Ma Barker, I'm heading to
He said-
California with $40 in my pocket. I'm either going to be broke or I'm going to make $1 million.
That's what he said.
Now, I can tell you that since we reported on some of this story in Scene Magazine and also on CTV News, I was contacted by some folks who gave me their own personal stories that they had in their family about Walt Disney approaching them down at the Covent Garden Market and trying to raise money for this endeavor that he had planned for California and what he was going to do there with his cartoons and his possible movie company. So that's a whole nother story. There are people that have reports about that. And I've also had clients, I'll call them old timers for lack of a better word, who say, Dan, that's not a news story. Everybody knows Disney stayed in London. Well, that's news to most of us my age. So it's a pretty incredible story. But now we know that Walt Disney had some connection to the area. And then he became famous. He made his millions of dollars and more in California with Mickey Mouse, his greatest creation, and other things. His movies, Snow White, won so many Academy Awards. But does Disney ever return to Canada?
1947. Yeah, he did return in 1947.
And do you know why he came back?
He wanted to look at his great-grandfather's place and his father's birthplace and his father's house that he lived in. He came back to check it out, come back and explore it, find out his roots, his father's roots.
Yeah.
And he did.
Did he actually go to Blue Vale?
He went to Blue Vale, and he went to Holmesville.
Oh yeah.
And thought he had his great grandfather's log house, and took pictures from all sides. Had his wife with him, and after he'd spent quite a bit of time checking it out, taking pictures, somebody told him that is not the house at all. It wasn't the place. So his wife never let him forget that.
I heard a story too. I heard a story too, Bob, about Walt showing up at the post office and saying, "Oh, hi, I'm Walt Disney." And the gentleman said to him, "Yeah, and I'm Mackenzie King, sure."
I heard that story. Yeah,
And now we know
yeah,
that, of course, he'd go to Godrich. Walt Disney went to Godrich. And we know that
yep.
town is designed in a very unique fashion. So we've got the courthouse in the middle of the
Mhm.
town, and then all the streets come out like the spoke of a wheel from the center of town. Now, that was in 1947 when Disney visited Godrich, correct?
Correct.
And at the time, he was, as I understand it, he was designing Disneyland and how
Disneyland.
Disneyland would be set up.
Yep.
And I think our producer may be able to put up some photos that show the town of Godrich from above and compare it to the layout of Disneyland, which opened in 1955. And it's incredible. The comparison is so similar. And although I don't think there's a record of it, there's got to be no question that Walt Disney was inspired by the design of Godrich when he went ahead with his design for Disneyland.
I agree. I agree 100%. Yep.
Yeah. So Disney visits there in 1947. Tell me a little bit more, if you can, about his stay in London, at least the reports that you've received about Ma Barker's rooming house. What can you tell me about the rooming house, if you know?
Well, the rooming house was owned by the uh,
King's Mills?
King's Mills, yeah. And Ma Barker lost her husband not long after they were married. And she made arrangements with the King's Mills to use that place so that people could have a reasonable place to stay. And so she spent 50 years, she ran that place for 50 years.
Wow.
And Walt Disney was probably her most famous person that she ever entertained. But my dad stayed in the same home, and Mrs. Barker told him the story that I've just told you about Walt Disney coming down and said, "I'm going to California, and I'm either going to be broke or I'm going to make $1 million." And he just started prior to that, not long prior to that, the animation part, not just cartoons, drawing cartoons, but the animation. And so when he went back to California, that's what he pursued.
Yeah.
Um,
And as I indicated, if you Google that, rooming house, Walt Disney, London, Ontario,
yeah,
you'll be directed to the London Public Library archives, which will tell you about that reference. And there was also a story in the London Free Press about it when the rooming house closed, when Ma Butler died at the age of 88.
correct.
There was some construction going on at 200 Queens, and they had to level the rooming house at that time. Um, this is an incredible story. Bob, I know there are many Londoners that probably have a little tidbit of information to pass along about this. One individual contacted me to say he was the usher at the Capitol Theater. And whenever a Disney film came out, Ma Butler was the first one there.
Yeah,
She was proud of what her boarder had accomplished.
yeah.
And she would be the first one to see a new Disney film at the Capitol Theater.
Hmm.
So some great stories here. It's a pretty phenomenal connection between the Disney family and Canada, and I think we can take some pride in knowing that Disney's father was a Canadian
Yes.
and was born just north of London. Anything you want to add about the Disney legacy before we wrap up the show? I think we've got a couple minutes left.
Well, I think as Canadians, we should be proud that Walt Disney's father was born in Canada and the Disney connections here. Walt Disney's father had 11 children too, big families. His grandfather had 11 children, and his great grandfather 16 children, and that's almost unheard of today. Families like that. But coming to a wooded area and working and his great grandfather had built a sawmill right on the Maitland River, and that was his main. I think one of his main sources of income was that sawmill, and that's registered in the registry in Goddard's there too. Um,
Yeah, that was pure wilderness at the time.
Pure
A
wilderness,
story written by
trees, hard work.
hard work,
Yeah,
heavily timbered, wolves, bears, all kinds of wildlife.
yeah,
And these pioneers, these Canadian pioneers, are just struggling to carve out an existence here in Canada.
yes,
I expect that the weather was a little bit better for Walt in California. and for his father than it was up here in Huron County. You know what those winters are like.
Yes, that's right.
So Walt made his fame and fortune. And more than that, and more importantly, he was an influence for so many in so many different ways, and continues to be that influence to people like your grandson. And that's something that the Canadian connection is something that we can be proud of there.
If you got
Bob,
a minute, if you got a
it's been-
minute, just to tell you that my grandson has been to the Walt Disney Family Museum in San Francisco, not connected with the Disney Corporation, but sponsored by Diane Walt's daughter family, that Walt Disney Family Museum in San Francisco. And one wall in that museum is voted or is dedicated to pictures of Canada and the stories of Canada in that museum.
Isn't that awesome? That's great. That's great. Maybe Walt had a little friendly mouse somewhere that inspired him to do Mickey Mouse. Bob, it's been great to have you here. Thanks for joining us. I know that you're retired, but you're probably busier than I am. So thanks for taking time out of your day to be here and to tell this incredible story about this Disney connection to Canada. Viewers, stay tuned for more stories on London Lights. We hope you've enjoyed this episode and will join us again. Have a good day.